Welcome to the new video of NeuroPhilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin. The moment that finds you. Have you ever wondered why certain content appears in your life at the exact moment you can no longer hold yourself together the way you used to? Not in a dramatic movie scene way, more like a quiet interruption, a strange pause. You're scrolling, you're moving through the day, and then something stops you. A title, a sentence, a voice, and you click. Not because you fully understand why, but because something in you recognizes it. Maybe this showed up after a tough day. Maybe it arrived in a moment of doubt, fatigue, or confusion. Maybe nothing big happened, yet you've been carrying an unnamed heaviness for weeks. Or maybe you can't even point to a reason, but you felt a subtle pull, like the part of you that normally stays hidden leaned forward and said, "Listen." Jung had a word for moments like this. He called it synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence, an encounter between the external world and an internal need. Not a random event that your brain tries to decorate with meaning, but an experience where the timing feels too precise, too intimate, too personally targeted to be dismissed as noise. It isn't magic and it isn't superstition. It is the psyche's way of revealing that something within you is shifting, and reality has started to echo that shift back to you. And here's the part most people miss. Synchronicity doesn't show up when you're comfortable. It doesn't appear when your life is running smoothly and your identity feels stable. It appears when you reach a threshold, when your inner world is saturated, when the usual coping strategies stop working. It appears when the soul can no longer tolerate the role you've been playing, even if the role has worked for years. So if you're here right now, consider the possibility that this isn't just content. It isn't just entertainment. It might be a mirror. It might be a warning. It might be an oracle in the simplest sense, something that reflects back what you already know but have been avoiding. Because the feeling you've been carrying, that vague discomfort, that growing emptiness, that hidden anger or restless sadness that seems to come from nowhere, is not a glitch. It is a message. A lot of people interpret that discomfort as weakness. They call it being ungrateful, being dramatic, being too sensitive. They tell themselves, "I should be fine." They compare their life to others and decide they have no right to feel what they feel. But Jung would argue the opposite. This discomfort is often the psyche's intelligence at work. It is the inner system that kept you alive now, trying to make you whole. When you ignore that voice long enough, it doesn't disappear. It gets louder. The psyche doesn't stop calling. It escalates. First, it whispers through feelings you can't explain. Then it speaks through patterns. Then it shouts through consequences. It may show up as anxiety that refuses to settle. It may show up as exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. It may show up as repeating situations that feel like the same lesson in different costumes. It may show up as a sense that you are living, but not really living, functioning, but not present, moving, but not moving forward. And the reason it feels so unsettling is because it threatens something the ego depends on, the story of who you are. Your identity is not just your personality. It is the entire structure of roles and expectations you have learned to wear. The responsible one, the strong one, the good son, the good girl, the achiever, the caretaker, the peacemaker, the one who never needs help, the one who always smiles. These roles begin as strategies, sometimes necessary, sometimes protective. But over time, they can harden into a prison. And one day the mask stops fitting. You feel it when you try to perform your usual self, and it takes double the energy. You feel it when you speak, and the words sound rehearsed even to you. You feel it when you force yourself to keep going, and something in you quietly refuses. You can still rationalize. You can still distract yourself. You can still pretend you're fine. But the truth keeps growling underneath the surface. That is the soul pushing toward change. Not just any change, not a cosmetic change, not a new routine or a new productivity system or a fresh start that leaves the deeper structure untouched. This kind of pressure is deeper. It is profound. It is non-negotiable. It is the rupture between who you have been until now and what is trying to emerge through you. Jung believed these moments are not accidents. They are calls to individuation, the process of becoming an authentic self, not the self you were rewarded for being, but the self you actually are. Individuation begins when the old setup reaches its limit, when the persona no longer protects you but suffocates you, when the life you built starts to feel like a life you're living for someone else. But here's the cruel detail. Almost no one responds immediately. Most people resist. They try to repair what should be allowed to die. They tighten their grip on the old identity. They work harder. They control more. They numb more. They cling to what once worked because the unknown feels terrifying. And that is where suffering intensifies. Because everything that no longer serves you, when forcibly maintained, turns into pain. It can turn into depression, illness, self-sabotage, destructive relationships, sudden collapses, or a slow inner decay that makes you feel like you're fading from your own life. Not because life is against you, but because your psyche is trying to evolve and you are trying to stay the same. Evolution does not happen in comfort. The butterfly does not emerge in a blooming garden. It breaks out of a tight cocoon, and in the same way, the new version of you is being generated now, inside pressure, doubt, confusion, and fear. So if you found yourself here, you do not need to understand everything yet. You don't need a full map. You don't even need certainty. What you need is honesty, the recognition that you can no longer continue as you are. That recognition is not the end of stability. It is the beginning of truth. And perhaps the real question isn't, why did this video appear? The real question is simpler and more frightening. Are you ready to let die who you pretended to be? Saturation and the silent collapse. There comes a moment when nothing is obviously wrong, yet everything feels off. From the outside, life appears intact. You wake up, fulfill your responsibilities, show up where you're expected to. You might even be praised for being consistent, reliable, strong, but internally something has shifted in a way you cannot undo. The structure that once held you together has begun to crack, quietly, invisibly, without permission. This is the phase Jung described as saturation. Saturation is not a crisis triggered by a single event. It doesn't require a breakup, a job loss, or a visible collapse. In fact, it often arrives when circumstances look good enough. That's what makes it so disorienting. You tell yourself that nothing terrible has happened. You reason that you should be grateful. You search for logical explanations for why you feel the way you do and come up empty. And yet the dissatisfaction persists. What has saturated is not your life, but your ego's narrative. The story you've been telling yourself about who you are, what you want, and why you're here has reached its limit. The psychic energy that once animated that story begins to drain. Tasks feel heavier. Motivation fades. What used to inspire you now feels flat. Even rest stops working because the exhaustion isn't physical. It's existential. This is where many people become afraid of their own inner world. They interpret the loss of drive as laziness. They label the emptiness as depression without asking what it might be pointing toward. They try to fix themselves, to return to a previous version that no longer exists. But Jung would say this isn't dysfunction. It's a necessary disintegration. The ego, by design, is limited. It survives by simplifying reality, by choosing a narrow identity that allows you to function. But when that identity has done all it can do, it begins to decay. The psyche withdraws its support, and without that support, the roles you play start to feel hollow. You may notice this in subtle ways. Conversations that once flowed now feel scripted. Achievements that once felt meaningful barely register. You sit in familiar spaces and feel like a stranger. You may even look at your own life and think, this should be mine, but it doesn't feel like it belongs to me anymore. This isn't ingratitude, it's alienation from an outdated self. Jung noted that during saturation, the individual often experiences contradictions. You feel tired even when you haven't exerted yourself. You feel sadness without a clear cause. You feel restless but don't know what you want to change. Pleasure loses its depth. Distraction loses its power. The mind circles the same questions without resolution, and the body begins to carry what the psyche can no longer suppress. Outwardly, you may still function. You may still perform. You may still meet expectations. But inwardly, an implosion has already begun. You are no longer living, you are maintaining, sustaining a structure that has lost its vitality out of habit, fear, or loyalty to an old identity. At this stage, most people try to compensate. They add more work, more goals, more stimulation, more social obligations. They keep themselves busy enough to avoid listening. But saturation cannot be outrun. The more you try to revive the old structure, the more exhausted you become, because what you are trying to resurrect is already dead. This is where the psyche demands something radically different. Presence. Presence with discomfort, presence with uncertainty, presence with the unbearable feeling that something has ended, even if it hasn't been officially declared. This discomfort is not asking to be eliminated. It is asking to be recognized as a signal that the old configuration of your life can no longer hold the totality of who you are becoming. Jung emphasized that every transformation begins with ruin, not because destruction is noble, but because reconstruction requires space. The psyche cannot build something new on top of a structure that refuses to collapse, and so it undermines it, slowly at first, then unmistakably. This is why the phase feels so disorienting. You are still standing, but the ground beneath you has softened. You are still speaking, but the voice feels distant. You are still moving, but without direction. It's like being in a play where the script has ended, yet the performance continues out of sheer momentum. And here lies the crucial choice, though it doesn't feel like one yet. You can interpret this phase as a problem to be solved, or as a message to be heard. If you treat it as a malfunction, you will fight it, numb it, suppress it. If you treat it as communication, you begin to listen. Listening doesn't mean acting immediately. It doesn't mean quitting your job or burning your life down. It means acknowledging, without judgment, that something within you has reached its limit, that the mask you've worn has served its purpose, that the energy that once sustained your identity is withdrawing for a reason. Saturation is not the end of meaning. It is the end of a false continuity. It is the psyche saying, you have gone as far as you can go this way. And when that message is finally heard, another movement begins. A movement Jung called enantiodromia, the psychic reversal, the moment when everything you have suppressed, ignored, or denied begins to rise. The collapse is not random. It is preparing the ground for its opposite. And whether you are ready or not, the turning has already started. Enantiodromia, when the psyche turns. There is a moment in every deep transformation when the psyche stops negotiating. Up to this point, it has whispered through discomfort, hinted through dissatisfaction, nudged through fatigue and restlessness. But once saturation is complete, the psyche initiates a movement that is no longer subtle. Carl Jung called this movement enantiodromia, a term borrowed from Greek philosophy, meaning the tendency of things to turn into their opposite. For Jung, this was not metaphorical language. It was a psychological law. Whenever a person lives in a one-sided way for too long, the unconscious begins to compensate. Balance is not optional in the psyche. If consciousness leans too heavily in one direction, the unconscious gathers force in the opposite one. And when the correction comes, it does not arrive politely. It erupts. This is the stage where people often say, I don't recognize myself anymore. Because the traits, impulses, emotions, and desires that surface now directly contradict the identity you have carefully maintained. If you built your life around being agreeable, anger emerges. If you lived through discipline and control, chaos intrudes. If you valued logic and restraint, emotion floods in. If you defined yourself through strength, vulnerability demands attention. This reversal feels frightening because it threatens the ego's sense of continuity. The ego believes survival depends on consistency, but the psyche cares less about consistency and more about wholeness. Enantiodromia is the psyche's way of restoring what was sacrificed along the way. Most people misunderstand this phase and interpret it as failure. They think something has gone wrong. They believe they are regressing, losing control, or falling apart. But Jung saw the opposite. He understood this rupture as a sign that the psyche is alive and actively correcting an imbalance that can no longer be sustained. What returns during enantiodromia is not random. It is what you pushed aside in order to become who you thought you had to be. The sensitivity you learned to suppress, the intuition you traded for approval, the creativity you buried for practicality, the anger you swallowed to keep the peace, the individuality you abandoned to belong. All of it waited patiently in the unconscious, and now it returns with urgency. This is why the experience feels overwhelming. The unconscious does not speak in polite sentences. It speaks in images, impulses, emotions, dreams, and sudden shifts in desire. You may feel drawn to things that once felt foreign. You may feel repelled by things you once chased. Your values wobble, your priorities invert. The life you built begins to feel misaligned with the person emerging underneath it. And here is the most unsettling truth. This process does not depend on your consent. You cannot logic your way out of enantiodromia. You cannot discipline it away. You cannot fix it by doubling down on the old identity. In fact, the more you try to maintain the old balance through force, the more violent the correction becomes. The psyche will escalate until you are forced to pay attention. This is why resistance intensifies suffering. People who fight this phase often experience anxiety, depression, psychosomatic illness, impulsive behaviors, or sudden life collapses. Not because they are weak, but because they are trying to hold a structure together that the psyche has already condemned. The pressure builds until something gives. But enantiodromia is not your enemy. What emerges now is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to complete you. Jung called this emerging material the shadow, not because it is evil, but because it exists outside the light of conscious identity. The shadow contains everything you are not allowed to be, everything you learned to hide, everything that didn't fit the image you had to maintain. Integration, not suppression, is the task. This does not mean acting out every impulse or burning your life down impulsively. It means listening. It means recognizing that the opposite qualities now surfacing carry information. They are correcting your one-sidedness. They are pointing toward a more truthful orientation to life. Jung believed individuation, the process of becoming a whole human being, requires this confrontation. You cannot become whole by remaining the same. You cannot become authentic without allowing the old self to be destabilized. Enantiodromia is the bridge between the false continuity of the ego and the deeper continuity of the self. And yet, this is where most people retreat. They cling to the old identity because it is familiar. They fear the unknown because it lacks guarantees. They label the emerging self as dangerous, irrational, or irresponsible. But what they are really afraid of is losing control over who they thought they were. The truth is simpler and harsher. Control has already been lost. The only question now is how you will relate to the reversal, with rigidity or curiosity, with panic or attention, with repression or dialogue. Because whether you cooperate or not, the psyche is already turning. And the more honestly you engage with what is emerging, the less destructive the transformation needs to be. In the next stage, this reversal becomes visible through unmistakable signs. In dreams, in synchronicities, in the sudden loss of identification with your old roles, and in an emptiness no achievement can fill. If you are paying attention, you may already be experiencing them. And if you are, the crossing has already begun. The signs that cannot be ignored. When the psyche commits to transformation, it does not announce itself politely. It does not wait for permission, nor does it explain its intentions in clear, rational language. Instead, it speaks symbolically. It speaks through images, patterns, disruptions, and experiences that impose themselves on your awareness, whether you want them to or not. Carl Jung devoted much of his life to observing these signals, and he noticed that every genuine turning point carries a set of unmistakable signs. These are not signs you choose to see. They appear precisely because the conscious mind is no longer listening. The first and most striking sign emerges in dreams. During periods of deep psychological change, dreams become vivid, repetitive, and symbolic. You may dream of death, collapse, falling, losing teeth, being naked in public, or watching familiar structures disintegrate. To the rational mind, these images feel disturbing. But to the unconscious, they are not warnings of destruction. They are announcements of transition. A collapsing house represents an identity that can no longer contain you. Nakedness symbolizes the stripping away of personas and defenses. Death in dreams, far from being a dark omen, often marks the end of an outdated way of being. The psyche speaks in symbols because symbols can carry contradictions at once. Loss and renewal, fear and potential, ending and beginning. When these dreams repeat, it is because something in you is ready to be released, even if consciousness is not yet ready to let go. The second sign is the intensification of synchronicities. Meaningful coincidences begin to cluster. A book seems to find you. A conversation answers a question you never spoke aloud. A phrase appears in different places, spoken by different people, in different contexts, yet carrying the same message. You may encounter the same themes repeatedly in videos, music, or chance meetings. Jung describes synchronicity as a moment when external reality bends to reflect an internal state. These events are not causal in the usual sense. They are symbolic alignments, mirrors between psyche and world. When synchronicities increase, it is because the unconscious is attempting to guide you through a transition that the rational mind resists. Reality itself begins to participate in the dialogue. The third sign is the gradual loss of identification with your old roles. You may still perform them, but something feels hollow. Work becomes mechanical. Relationships feel scripted. You hear yourself speak and feel detached from your own words. What once gave you a sense of belonging now feels constricting, even false. This loss of identification is deeply unsettling because identity is the ego's anchor. Without it, you feel unmoored. You may think, if I am not this role, then who am I? But Jung would say this disidentification is necessary. The psyche cannot reveal a deeper self while consciousness clings to a persona that no longer fits. The role becomes a prison precisely because it once served as protection. The body often responds before the mind fully understands. Energy drops, tension increases. You may feel resistance in your chest or throat when trying to continue as before. Speech hesitates. Motivation collapses. The body refuses to cooperate with a performance the soul has already abandoned. The fourth sign is the most confusing and the most frightening. A deep dissatisfaction with no clear external cause. From the outside, things may appear stable or even successful. You may have financial security, recognition, relationships, or health, and yet none of it touches the growing void inside. No compliment brings relief. No achievement brings peace. Pleasure loses its depth. This is not clinical depression, though it is often mistaken for it. It is what Jung understood as an existential void. A vacuum created when the old meaning structure has collapsed and the new one has not yet formed. This emptiness feels unbearable because the ego is wired to seek content, goals, and direction. The void offers none of these. It only offers silence. To the rational mind, this silence feels like danger. It demands immediate resolution. But psychologically, this void is fertile ground. It is the space in which something new can emerge, provided it is not prematurely filled with distractions, substitutes, or false certainty. These signs are not problems to be fixed. They are communications to be received. They do not want your efficiency, your optimism, or your quick answers. They want your attention. They want your willingness to remain present without immediately acting, judging, or escaping. Jung warned that when these signals are ignored, they escalate. Synchronicities stop whispering and begin to shout. Dreams intensify. Anxiety rises. The body manifests symptoms. Emotions overflow. What was gently asking to be acknowledged now forces its way into awareness. If you recognize these signs, it is not because you are broken. It is because the psyche has already made a decision. The old self is dissolving. The new has not yet taken form, and you are standing in the narrow passage between them. This threshold is uncomfortable, uncertain, and deeply destabilizing, but it is also precise. You are not lost. You are being reoriented. The question is no longer whether change is happening. The question is whether you will meet it consciously. Because beyond this threshold lies the most difficult stage of all, psychological death, the surrender of identity itself. And only by passing through it can a more truthful self be born? That is the crossing that awaits next. Psychological death and the courage to cross. There comes a point in every genuine transformation when understanding is no longer enough. Insight loses its power. Interpretation brings no relief. You can name the process, recognize the patterns, even explain them with precision, yet nothing moves forward. This is the moment Carl Jung described as psychological death, the dissolution of an identity that has already exhausted its purpose. At this stage, life enters suspension. The old no longer works, and the new has not yet arrived. You stand in a psychic landscape of ruins, surrounded by structures that once defined you, but now feel empty and uninhabitable. Many experience this as despair, not because they are weak, but because the ego is losing its footing. The ego survives through continuity. Psychological death removes continuity altogether. This is why the experience feels unbearable. Most people try to escape it. They rebuild the old life with greater force. They chase quick solutions, productivity, reassurance, or spiritual bypasses that promise immediate clarity. But Jung was clear. No deep transformation is possible without the collapse of the ego's central narrative. Not the destruction of the person, but the dissolution of the structures that were mistaken for the self. Psychological death is not about annihilation. It is about disidentification. The titles, the labels, the masks, the stories you told to belong, to be safe, to be valued, all of them must be released. And this hurts because even what suffocates us offers familiarity. The known, even when painful, feels safer than the unknown. Letting go feels like floating in dark water without knowing whether land exists. The psyche demands trust where the mind demands guarantees. The first task in this phase is not action, but mourning. You are not supposed to be efficient here. You are not supposed to fix yourself or move on quickly. You are grieving the loss of who you were and who you pretended to be. Write farewell letters to your old roles. Acknowledge how they protected you. Thank them for their service. Then release them. This is not symbolic theater. It is a psychological signal to the unconscious that you are willing to cross. The second task is to create space for the unknown. The conditioned mind seeks constant stimulation, explanations, and reassurance. But Jung warned that transformation cannot occur until acceptance is complete. Acceptance means staying with the void without rushing to fill it. Sitting with restlessness, allowing silence, letting confusion exist without forcing clarity. In this silence, something begins to stir. The psyche speaks most clearly when the noise stops. This is why dreams intensify in this phase, why synchronicities sharpen, why intuition becomes louder. The unconscious begins to reorganize itself, but only if consciousness does not interfere prematurely. You are not meant to control this stage. You are meant to endure it. The third task is attention. Not passive waiting, but listening. Keep a record of dreams. Track recurring symbols, phrases, and encounters. Ask simple questions, not intellectual ones. What is dying in me? What feels false? What feels alive, even if it scares me? When the unconscious senses your willingness to listen, it responds with guidance. Subtle at first, then clearer. The fourth task is action without certainty. This is where many hesitate. They wait for confidence, clarity, or a complete map. But psychological transformation does not work that way. The psyche requires movement. Small, honest gestures carry immense power. A conversation you have avoided, a boundary you finally set, a truth you speak quietly, even if your voice shakes. These actions are not about outcomes. They are signals. They tell the unconscious, I am participating. And when participation begins, the process accelerates. Doors open, alignments occur, energy returns in unexpected ways. This is not the return of the old self. It is the slow formation of a new orientation. Jung called this the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming what you truly are beyond conditioning, fear, and borrowed identities. Individuation is not comfortable. It does not promise happiness as a permanent state, but it offers something deeper: alignment, integrity, a sense that your inner and outer life are no longer at war. The turning point is not the climax of this process. It is the threshold, the place where you stop running and start walking with the transformation rather than against it. You do not emerge with a finished identity. You emerge with a direction. If this resonates, it is not because you are broken. It is because something in you is ready. Ready to stop performing. Ready to stop pretending. Ready to let the old self die so that a truer one can be born. You are not behind. You are not lost. You are in the passage between who you were and who you are becoming. And that passage, however dark it feels, is the most honest place you can stand.